Today on Know the Truth with Philip de Courcy.
You cannot count on tomorrow, so you must take advantage of today. Therefore, in business terms, yesterday is a cancelled check, tomorrow is a promissory note, today is cash in hand. Invest it for God's glory.
Someone once said, if you want to make God laugh, tell him your plans. It's easy to believe we've got tomorrow all figured out, but often God has something entirely different in store. Welcome to Know the Truth with Senior Pastor of Kindred Church in Anaheim Hills, California, Philip de Courcy. Today, Pastor Philip encourages us to take a humbler approach to planning for the future. It's a powerful message from our series in James, When Faith Finds Its Feet. Now, here's Pastor Philip with his message, Man proposes, but God disposes.
You and I need to be reminded often that life must be lived with deference to God and dependence upon Him. Proverbs tells us in Proverbs chapter 21 and verse 1 that God indeed is in control of life. In Proverbs 21 and verse 1, the king's heart is in the hand of the Lord. Like the rivers of water, He turns it wherever He wishes. In Proverbs 16 verse 9, again we're reminded of both the sovereign and providential control of God concerning the affairs of life. Proverbs 16 and verse 9, a man's heart plans his ways, but the Lord directs his steps. Man proposes, but God disposes. The book of Proverbs reminds us that the movement of nations, the decisions of kings, the steps of man, and the roll of the dice all fall under the sovereign superintendence and supervision of God. And therefore, we must duly pay deference and show dependence upon God in our daily lives. Men are free to make their choices, but their choices are not free from God. And that's a theme that James picks up here in chapter 4 of his letter. There are a number of things here. First of all, what I call the assumption. James chapter 4 and verse 13. Come now, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go to such and such a city, spend a year there, buy and sell and make a profit. The assumption regards certain businessmen, it would seem, in this church, implement a plan that will make a killing financially and commercially in a certain sector. James butts into their conversation. He elbows his way into their boardroom meeting and he says, come on, guys. This kind of talk is unbecoming of the church of Jesus Christ that you profess to belong to as businessmen. Because he says there's someone missing from this table. There's someone who's been left out of this board meeting, and it's God Himself. The one you profess as Lord and Master. I got to say something before I say anything else. James isn't saying that it's wrong for these businessmen to plan. There's nothing wrong with planning. The book of Proverbs in chapter 6 and verse 6 following tells us what? It tells us that there's wisdom in going to the ant and considering her ways that we might be wise. The wisdom writer in Proverbs is encouraging us to take a look at the ant who gathers and prepares for a long and barren winter, who plans for emergencies and difficulties. There's wisdom in preparing. There's wisdom in planning. You need to sow your seed at a certain time of the year if you are to enjoy a harvest later on. The Bible doesn't condemn planning. The Bible doesn't condemn preparing. I don't think that the Bible or James chapter 4 here is saying that it's unchristian to have a 5-year plan. James is not trying to banish planning from our lives. He's only trying to challenge that self-sufficiency. That planning that keeps God for Sunday but leaves him out from Monday to Saturday. And so there was a certain assumption on their part that James wants to address. James lays bare two weaknesses in their thinking. They were assuming the events of tomorrow, when in reality no human knows what tomorrow holds. And they were not taking into consideration the transitoriness and uncertainty of human life. And so he chastises them. Come on, fellas. What's all this talk about going to this city and this town, selling this and buying that, and you don't even know what tomorrow holds? You ought to say, if God wills, you'll do this and do that. Because if you really thought about the mystery of life and the measure of life, you wouldn't speak so presumptuously. And you wouldn't speak so confidently. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we shall live and do this or that. But now you boast in your arrogance, and all such boasting is evil. James is saying to these businessmen that their plans are subject to approval. They need God's rubber stamp, or else your plans aren't worth the paper they're written on. That takes us back, doesn't it, to Proverbs 16 and verse 9, which we quoted. Man makes his plans, but the Lord directs his steps. You and I need to acknowledge God's sovereignty. You and I need to understand our total and utter and daily dependence upon God. It is in him we move and we have our being, and it's only because of God's will we shall live and do this or do that. James wants us to affirm that anything we are and anything we have is due to the providence of God. And James wants us to acknowledge that. He wants us to acknowledge God's sovereignty and God's providence, and that we are utterly dependent upon him. John Calvin, in his commentaries, said this: when we look back on our life from the perspective of eternity, we're going to see that the power of Satan was so great, that the weakness of our flesh was so feeble, and that the hostility of the world was so strong, that every day of our life, if God had not intervened, we would never have made it through a day. Isn't that true? Isn't that what Jeremiah teaches us in Lamentations? If it were not for the Lord's mercies, we would be consumed, but great is his faithfulness, and his mercies are new every morning. You and I need to acknowledge the providence of God declared and defined in the Venerable Heidelberg Catechism, stated as such: the almighty and everywhere present power of God, whereby, as it were, by his hand, he upholds and governs heaven, earth, and all creatures, so that herbs and grass, rain and drought, fruitful and barren years, meat and drink, health and sickness, riches and poverty, yea, all things come not by chance, but by his fatherly hand. And James wants these men to remind themselves of that. He wants them to affirm that fact, to stress that theology and reality in their lives, that nothing comes to them but comes through the hand of God. And if their business is to prosper, it will prosper because of God's hand. And they've got to stop this arrogant boasting. Nehemiah acknowledges that, doesn't he? Where he says, concerning the rebuilding of Jerusalem and the advances that they were making despite the opposition they were facing, he says on a number of occasions, read it for yourself, and the good hand of God was upon us. We ought to say, if the Lord wills. We ought to say it honestly. God willing is more than a matter of speech. It is a manner of life. You and I have got to acknowledge that. You and I have got to communicate both in word and in action that we recognize our utter dependence upon God, that we need to trust him with all our heart, that we need to lean not on our own understanding, that we need to acknowledge him in all our ways. Paul told the Jews at Ephesus in Acts chapter 18 and verse 21 that he would like to return for some return and renewed ministry among them, and he uses these words, if God wills. He uses similar language In 1 Corinthians 4, verse 19, he wrote to the Corinthians that he planned another visit to them. And again he says, if the Lord wills. In fact, he wanted to remain with them for a considerable time. And he tells us that if that was to happen, it would only happen, according to 1 Corinthians 16:7, if the Lord permitted. A similar thought is doubtless inferred from Paul's statement that he hoped to send Timothy to Philippi in chapter 2, verse 19 of that letter. And he says this, I hope to send Timothy to you shortly in the Lord. It's Paul's way of recognizing God's sovereignty and providence, that Timothy would only get to Ephesus, that he would only get to Corinth if the Lord willed it. Yes, God has his hand on airplane timetables and ship schedules and the road conditions that you and I find ourselves in. Paul's acknowledging honestly, and so must we, that we will only do this and we will only do that if the Lord wills. I can tell you this. When I was growing up as a boy in Rathkill Baptist Church in Northern Ireland, as the announcements were stated every Sunday morning, invariably, unremittently, the church secretary would always end the announcements with these words. They are branded in my mind. And we make all these announcements subject to God's will. Now, after a time, to me, they were words that kind of had a hollow ring to them. They could be stated so glibly, and they became part of the tradition of our church. And yet, I've reminded myself perhaps this week in reading the very words of James, where he actually seems to say, you ought to say. That has not that kind of faith-filled language fallen from our vocabulary? Did you finish a sentence this week regarding going to the dentist or going to shopping or returning from your vacation with these words, if the Lord wills? Maybe you've said to your wife, I'll see you tonight at Max and Irma's at 7 o'clock on Central Avenue, if the Lord wills. In fact, if you read the Word of God, and we'll not take time to get into this, but here's the thought. The Word of God encourages us to have faith-filled language as part of our conversation. The Jew was encouraged during the Passover feast to state verbally and communicate clearly to his children the significance of the events. Throughout the Psalms, the generation that was dying was encouraged to speak to the generation that was emerging of the power and the wonders and the acts of God. They were to retell the Exodus story. They were to recount the actions of God in their midst. They were to fill their conversation with theistic storytelling. And while I'm only too aware that that kind of language can be stated glibly, I'm also very aware that what we take for granted today can be forgotten tomorrow. And the less we say grace before our meals, for example, the less we will remind ourselves that our food is provided by God, and the more we will come to think that we really provided it ourselves. Or Mr. Kroger, whoever he is. And it's the same with the future. If we stop saying, if the Lord wills, it's more likely we will come to assume that our lives are fixed and planned and determined by ourselves, that we are the captain of our own fate and the master of our own souls. So James says, you ought to say, the Lord wills. I don't think we need to get slavish about it, but why not try and introduce that kind of language into your conversation this week? As you state something you hope to do, a destination you hope to reach, a job you hope to complete, a pleasure you hope to enjoy, round off the sentence by saying, if the Lord wills. Because we must say it honestly and we must say it humbly. You ought to say, if the Lord wills, we shall live and do this or that. But now you boast in your arrogance, all such boasting is evil. They were not saying it. They were not saying it honestly, and they were not saying it humbly. In fact, they were presuming upon God's goodness. We have a natural tendency to live autonomously, to take credit to ourselves for those things that have come from the hand of God. We forget, as Paul reminds us in 1 Corinthians 4, verse 7, for who makes you differ from another? And what do you have that you did not receive? Powerful question, isn't it? What do you have that you did not receive? your house, your health, your wealth, your kids. What do you have that you did not receive? Nothing. And so when you and I don't fill our language with these kind of statements and fill our mind with these kind of thoughts, we are in danger of falling into boasting. Boasting which is arrogant, boasting which is evil. The boasting of Nebuchadnezzar. Back in Daniel chapter 4, we find Nebuchadnezzar walking the palace grounds. And here's what we read, verse 30. The king spoke, saying, is not this great Babylon that I have built for a royal dwelling by my mighty power and for the honor of my majesty? While the word was still in the king's mouth, a voice fell from heaven. King Nebuchadnezzar, to you it is spoken, the kingdom has departed from you. And they shall drive you from men, and your dwelling shall be in the beasts of the field. They shall make you eat grass like oxen, and 7 times shall pass over you until you know that the Most High rules in the kingdom of man and gives it to whomever he chooses. That very hour the word was fulfilled concerning Nebuchadnezzar. He was driven from men and ate grass like oxen. His body was wet with the dew of heaven till his hair had grown like eagle's feathers and his nail like bird's claws. Then at the end of that time, here's what Daniel says concerning Nebuchadnezzar, that he lifted up his eyes to heaven and his understanding returned to him, and he blessed the Most High God and praised him and honored him who lives forever and ever. I like that phrase, his understanding returned to him. It was like he woke up and said, Nebuchadnezzar, what were you thinking? What did you have you didn't receive? You took the credit. You and I must acknowledge our dependence upon God honestly and humbly and repeatedly and daily. Lest we vaunt ourselves and we flaunt ourselves. Pride is a horror show to God. Pride is the idolatrous worship of oneself, and it is the national religion of hell itself. James says it is unbecoming of the children of God to boast in their planning and not to acknowledge God in their preparing. I love that movie, Rudy. I tend to watch it at least once a year. I tend to watch it alone now because everybody in the house has watched it enough. But I can watch it again and again and again. It's the story of Rudy Reinecker, who wanted to play ball at Notre Dame. He was from a blue-collar family in Indiana, couldn't afford a scholarship. His grades were not the kind of grades that would have even helped you sneak into Notre Dame. But as you watch the movie, and you probably know something of the story, he eventually does get into the university and he plays one game. Yet there's that scene in the movie early on where he's trying to get into Notre Dame, and he tries to use one of the priests in the theological school that's associated with the university. And he can't understand why he can't get into the school because of all his efforts. And he's hoping this priest might have a word with the one who can make things happen. But there's a little bit of dialogue that stands out in that movie that just came to my mind the afternoon as I poured over these notes. The priest sits him down and tries to comfort him in the knowledge that sometimes God is mysterious. In fact, he says this, Rudy, he says, after 20 years of theological study, I have learned 2 things. I have learned there is a God, and I have learned I am not him. It's not a great deal after 20 years of theological study, but it's certainly first base. There is a God, and we're not him. In fact, he made us, and we are the sheep of his pasture, according to Psalm 100 and verse 5. And in recognizing that, we must recognize our dependence upon the shepherd. The assumption, the affirmation, and then in verse 17, we're done, the admonition. It's very simple. Therefore, to him who knows to do good and does not do it, to him it is sin. This is what's been called the sin of omission. The sin of commission are the wrong things you actually do. In fact, the teacher was teaching her Sunday school class the difference between the sins of omission and the sins of commission. And having explained that the sin of commission were the sins you actually did, she asked if anybody understood what the sins of omission were, to which a little boy replied, "Those are the ones we want to do but haven't actually got round to doing." And that's not true, actually. You can sin by doing wrong. That's the sin of commission. A flagrant, plain breaking of the revealed will of God in the law of God, the commandments of God. You can do wrong by doing wrong. That's the sin of commission. But you can do wrong by not doing right. That's the sin of omission. And James reminds us of that. Therefore, to him who knows to do good and does not do it, to him it is sin. He's reminding these guys, you should have known better. But I think he's actually saying something more than that. It's very simple. Because this verse relates to the verses we've just read. Therefore, as a concluding thought, it relates to the preceding verses. And here's what I think he's driving at when he talks about the things that are left undone that should be done. And he says, how can we get to that point? We get to that point when we're overconfident about the future. Because when we become overconfident about the future, we'll neglect our responsibilities in the present. These men were becoming overconfident about the future. We'll do this tomorrow, and we'll go and do that a year from now. They were becoming overconfident about the future, and they were not concentrating on their responsibilities towards God at that very moment, reminding themselves of their frailty and the transitory nature of life. And you and I must remind ourselves of that fact as we close. You cannot count on tomorrow, so you must take advantage of today. You can plan and you can prepare about tomorrow, but don't be building your hopes there, because tomorrow might never materialize, the sun might never rise, and therefore what you do today with the breath you have and the time you hold, you got to do it and do it now. You might be able to do something more tomorrow, but who knows? Therefore, when you know you ought to do something, don't wait till tomorrow to do it. You can't be overconfident about the future. You've got to meet your responsibilities now. Or else you'll fall into the sin of omission because you have an overconfidence in the time and opportunity that you have left, which may not be true. Therefore, in business terms as we close, yesterday is a cancelled check. Tomorrow is a promissory note. Today is cash in hand. Invest it for God's glory.
You never know what tomorrow will bring, so instead, we should look for ways to honor God today. You're listening to Know the Truth in a message titled Man Proposes, but God Disposes, from Bible teacher Philip de Courcy. You might be thinking about a friend or a loved one who needs to hear today's teaching. To replay or share this message, visit ktt.org. At Know the Truth, our mission is to share the life-changing message of the gospel with a world in need of God's truth. When you support this ministry with a gift of any amount, you can help bring powerful biblical teaching to listeners all around the globe. As a thank you for your generous gift, we'd love to send you a thought-provoking book, I Have My Doubts, by author Dr. Philip Ryken. Through 10 hope-filled Bible stories, this resource explores the kinds of doubts we all face about God's power, His justice, timing, and presence. You'll be reminded that even faithful believers wrestled with uncertainty, and that God meets us with grace, truth, and the opportunity for deeper faith. To request your copy, just call 888-644-8811 or visit ktt.org. And if you'd like even more Bible teaching from Pastor Philip, be sure to check out the So True devotional available on our website at ktt.org. This weekly devotional is crafted to help you connect with God's Word in a simple, meaningful way. You can read the latest edition of the So True devotional right now by visiting ktt.org. And if you're in the area, we'd love to invite you and your family and friends to a special summer concert featuring award-winning singer, musician, and pianist Gordon Mote. He'll be performing at Kindred Church in Anaheim Hills on Sunday night, August 3rd. For tickets and more information, visit kindredchurch.org/Gordon Mote. I'm Wayne Shepherd. Join us again tomorrow for more Bible teaching from pastor and Bible teacher Philip de Courcy here on Know the Truth. Today's program was produced and sponsored by Know the Truth Incorporated. Jesus said, "You shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free."